There is a generation that remembers a world before screens became mirrors, before childhood was documented, curated, and shared. They grew up in the 1970s, a decade suspended between the dreams of revolution and the arrival of something quieter, more uncertain. They were children of parents who had survived wars and economic collapse, raised in homes where emotional expression was often a luxury no one could afford. These people learned early that attention was earned, not given. That boredom was a space you filled yourself. That loneliness was something you carried quietly, because no one was coming to ask if you were okay. And now, decades later, they carry a psychology shaped by absence of supervision, of language for feelings, of permission to need. They are the generation that learned independence before they learned to ask for help. They were the children who came home to empty houses and let themselves in with keys hung around their necks. The ones who made their own snacks, settled their own arguments, and invented their own games in streets that stretched long and unsupervised. Until the streetlights came on in the 1970s, childhood existed in a strange and particular freedom, a kind of benign neglect that wasn't considered neglect at all, but simply the way things were. Parents worked, doors stayed unlocked, children roamed, and no one thought to ask if anyone was watching, because the neighborhood itself was supposed to be watching, except it wasn't. Not really. What emerged from this landscape was a generation trained in self-reliance before they had language for their own fear. They learned to navigate the world without a map, without check-ins, without the soft reassurance that someone was thinking about them when they weren't in the room. And so they became children who didn't expect to be thought about, who didn't expect to be missed. This wasn't abandonment in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, a low hum of absence. Parents were present at dinner, but emotionally elsewhere, worn down by work, by bills, by their own unprocessed wars and depressions. There was food on the table, but rarely conversation about feelings. There was shelter, but not always safety to be said. And so these children learned a crucial, painful lesson, that their emotional needs were secondary, that to need attention was to be a burden, that the world would not stop to notice if they were struggling, so they had better figure it out themselves. Psychologically, this creates what researchers call compulsive self-reliance, a bone-level belief that asking for help is weakness, that depending on others is dangerous, that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. It's not confidence, it's survival dressed up as independence. They became adults who can solve nearly any problem alone, who rarely complain, who handle crisis with eerie calm because crisis is just another Tuesday. But beneath that competence is a loneliness they've never been taught to name, a belief, buried so deep they don't recognize it as belief, that no one is coming, that they are, fundamentally, on their own. This is the hidden cost of the unsupervised childhood, not the scraped knees or the risky adventures, but the internalized message that their inner world didn't matter enough to be asked about, that feelings were inconvenient, that emotional pain was something you walked off, like a bruise, and so they learned to walk it off, everything. Heartbreak, anxiety, grief, fear. They learned to keep moving, keep functioning, keep their faces neutral. They became experts at appearing fine, but fine is not the same as okay, and functional is not the same as whole. Now, as adults, they struggle with vulnerability in ways they don't always recognize. They're the ones who say I'm fine reflexively, even when they're not, who feel uncomfortable when someone asks how they're really doing, who interpret care as pity and support as condescension. Because deep down, they still believe that needing someone is a kind of failure. They are competent, capable, self-sufficient, and often quietly exhausted by the weight of never being able to put it down. This is the psychology of the 1970s child. Strong because they had to be, independent because no one was coming, and lonely in a way they've learned not to mention, because mentioning it would mean admitting they needed something, and needing was the one thing they were never supposed to do. They didn't know, as children, that their parents were carrying ghosts, that the man who came home tired and silent had survived a war he never spoke about, that the mother who kept the house immaculate and her feelings locked away had grown up in a depression that taught her emotions were a luxury no one could afford. The 1970s, children were raised by people who had survived too much to process any of it. Their parents had lived through wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, through economic collapse and social upheaval, through losses that were never grieved, traumas that were never named, fears that were swallowed whole and carried forward into the quiet suburbs, where nothing was supposed to hurt anymore. But pain doesn't disappear because you refuse to look at it. It simply changes shape. It becomes the way you parent, the way you love, The way you teach your children what it means to be strong, and what these parents taught, without meaning to, was that strength meant silence, that to survive, you buried what hurt. You didn't talk about feelings because talking didn't change anything. You didn't cry because crying was weakness. You didn't ask for comfort because comfort made you soft. And the world required you to be hard. This was the inheritance, not cruelty, but emotional unavailability as a survival strategy. A kind of love that provided but didn't nurture, that fed and clothed and housed but didn't ask, didn't listen, didn't hold space for the messy, inconvenient truth of a child's inner life. Psychologists call this emotional neglect, and it's one of the most misunderstood forms of childhood wounding because nothing overtly terrible happens. There's no abuse to point to, no clear trauma to name. There's just an absence, a silence where attunement should have been, a pattern of needs expressed and needs ignored, until the child stops expressing them at all. The 1970s child learned to read their parents' moods like weather systems, when to be quiet, when to stay out of the way, when it was safe to exist loudly, and when invisibility was the better choice. They became hypervigilant to emotional climates, experts at managing other people's feelings, while never being taught to manage their own. And they learned the central rule of their household, spoken or unspoken: your feelings are your problem, handle them yourself. That's so they did. They learned to self-soothe in ways that weren't always healthy, through withdrawal, through performance, through becoming so good and so competent that maybe, finally, someone would notice, or through numbing, television, food, later alcohol, anything to quiet the persistent ache of not being seen. What they didn't learn was that feelings are information, that sadness isn't weakness but a signal, that anger isn't dangerous but a boundary trying to assert itself, that fear isn't shameful but the body's way of saying something here needs attention. They didn't learn that it's okay to need people, that vulnerability isn't collapse but connection, that asking for help isn't failure but wisdom. Instead, they learned to be strong, endlessly, exhaustingly strong. They became adults who can shoulder almost anything, who rarely break down, who pride themselves on not being needy or dramatic or too much. They became the friends everyone calls in a crisis, the employees who never complain, the partners who don't ask for much. But beneath that armor is a child, who still doesn't believe they're allowed to fall apart, who still thinks that needing comfort means they've failed at being a person, who carries a deep, unspoken belief that love is conditional on not being a burden. This is the inheritance of silence, a generation of people who are extraordinarily capable of caring for others, and almost incapable of letting others care for them, who give freely but receive reluctantly, who are terrified, underneath it all, that if they show how much they're struggling, they'll be too much, and they'll be left alone. The cruelest irony is that they already feel alone. They have felt alone since they were children, coming home to empty houses, learning to solve their own problems, carrying their fears quietly because no one ever asked if they were afraid. They are alone in rooms full of people who love them, because they've never learned to let that love in, because letting it in would mean admitting they need it. And needing is the one thing they were taught, more thoroughly than anything else, never to do that. This is what they carry, not the memory of a specific wound, but the weight of 1,000 small moments when they needed someone and no one came, when they hurt and no one asked why, when they learned, slowly and completely, that their emotional survival was their own responsibility, and they survived. They are surviving still, but survival is not the same as healing, and strength is not the same as wholeness.